îl știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. до окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Страна моя родная, на колени, под колени, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. За столом никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Страна моя родная, на колени, под колени, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Над страной весенний ветер веет, с каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Страна моя родная, на колени, под колени, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет.
что рабочий ты сам. И так как все мы люди, то должны мы извинить, и что-то есть. Хотят накормить нас пустой болтовней, чертям спасибо за честь. Марш левый, 2, 3, марш левый, 2, 3, взять ряды, товарищ нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как ты рабочий, то не жди, что нам поможет другой. Себе мы свободу добудем твою своей рабочей рукой. Марш левый, 2, 3, марш левый, 2, 3, встать ряды, товарищ нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. In der Arbeiter Arbeitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. Rein dich ein in der Arbeiter Arbeitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Pod słońcem rasti jasna dzieci, rasti i cvjetaj zemljo radnih ljudi i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napući i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom костяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome. And you join us tonight for the special anniversary show. It is almost within a week or so, 108 years since the Great Red October, the otherwise known as the Bolshevik Revolution. And so, following a yearly tradition, we look at the October Revolution and examine a particular facet of it. And this time, what I'm going to be doing is looking at the actions of Lenin with regards to the preparation of the revolution and the lessons that this can give us as to Lenin as a great strategic and tactical planner of political and military operations, but also like his understanding of the need for to get what he referred to as the art of the insurrection right. Now, before we get to the discussion at hand, be sure to like and share this stream if you haven't done so already. So we will begin. And yes, we are currently live on YouTube and on Twitch and on X and on Rumble. Would have been on Kick, but I need to sort out the account on that. I haven't done something necessary apparently, so I will get back to streaming on Kick when I've sorted out the technical requirements there. So tonight, going to be looking at the Bolshevik Revolution through the lens of Lenin's constant examination and re-examination of slogans and program, and how the party was connecting with the masses, and how this evolved to the point where the insurrection of the that saw the overthrow of the provisional government headed by Kerensky was possible. So to start off with, of course, the great October Socialist Revolution is one of the most misrepresented and misunderstood events in recent world history. And I mean, by recent, I mean relatively recent. The perception of this in popular culture, if indeed it is perceived at all, is usually as Lenin overthrowing the Tsar. The provisional government is, well, barely mentioned by the reactionaries. In fact, the name of Alexander Kerensky, the man who was minister president at the time, is largely forgotten these days, except by ourselves, Marxist-Leninists, who constantly examine and re-examine the Great October Revolution, and by certain professional historians. But if you had to ask most people who the Bolsheviks overthrew in October of 1917, if they knew it all, they would probably say the Tsar. The provisional government has largely been lost to history. And that's not an accident, because if you actually examined the record of the provisional government, you would see one that was profoundly wretched. And we'll get into the reasons why in just a moment. Now, going back to, of course, the February Revolution, because, of course, it was the February Revolution that overthrew the Tsar, and, or I should more accurately say, ended the Romanov dynasty in terms of its viability as a ruling stratum in the old Russian Empire. Because the way this unfolded, of course, was that there was a Russian revolutionary process, which I would argue lasted at least 12 years, from 1905 to 1917, arguably longer. Arguably, it lasted at least from 1905 all the way through to 1924, with the end of the Russian Revolutionary War, referred to as the Civil War. But the point about all of this is that the end of the Tsardom was brought about by a mass working class uprising that was centered around the city of Petrograd, which saw the situation escalate to the point where the Russian bourgeoisie acted to take power for themselves, and the Tsardom dissolved itself, essentially. Tsar Nicholas II, a absolutely pathetic, useless loser, who, the fact that the modern day Russian monarchists want to turn this guy into a saint just tells you what pathetic, useless losers they are. People commemorating this guy who was completely useless as a ruler, an utter disaster, and trying to turn him into some kind of great warrior saint is laughable, quite frankly. But what do you expect from a bunch of reactionaries whose visions of history, whose understanding of history, might as well be taken from a Marvel comic book, not even a particularly good one either. So the overthrow of the Tsardom came about following 3 years of, or really 2.5 years, of an incredibly destructive war that essentially saw the institutions of the Russian state, headed by the Tsar, disintegrate. The reason why there was an outbreak of rioting in Petrograd in late February, by the way, that's the old style calendar, late February 1917, was because the population was starving. The population was starving in the cities. The army was malnourished, poorly supplied, poorly led, and had been losing on the battlefield against the Kaiser's army for many, many months. In fact, by the time we get to the February Revolution, the army of the Germans was reaching a point where it was openly threatening Petrograd itself. You see, if you look at the map of the advances of the Imperial German Army into 1917, you can see that they were up to the point where they were almost ready to take Riga in Latvia, and had serious plans to do a rapid advance on Petrograd or St. Petersburg, depending upon what nomenclature you want to use, and take that. Now, this is crucial for actually understanding the frenzied debates that were going on in Russia in 1917 between Kerensky on the one hand, the Mensheviks and the SRs, and Lenin and the Bolsheviks on the other. Because what you come to see when you read into the various machinations that were going on during that time was that the Russian bourgeoisie was more than prepared to sell most of Russia to the Germans, or at least most of European Russia, or to have it fragmented into 1,000 pieces by the Anglo-French imperialists. Another fact that the Russian monarchists and the Russian bourgeois liberals these days really don't like to talk about. But point about it is that by February of 1917, the Imperial German Army was in a position where it could seriously threaten the Russian imperial capital, St. Petersburg. It was in a position where it could have, if things had continued the way they were going, have overrun it in the end. And this is one of the key debates that kept going on all the way through 1917, because, of course, with the disintegration of the Tsarist government, the war did not end because the Russian bourgeoisie did not want it to end. And this, of course, forms part of the free point demands, free point program that was put by the Bolsheviks to the workers and peasants of the old Russian Empire throughout 1917. Peace, bread, and land. And the peace, of course, the peace demand was designed to appeal to the biggest single class in the old Russian Empire, which is, of course, the peasantry, who made up the great bulk of the ranks of the army, who were dying in large numbers and on the front lines, and who had reached a stage of total demoralization when faced with the advance of the Imperial German Army. Now, so peace being the first demand, bread being the second. Of course, it was the breakdown of the supply chains between the city and the countryside, and the failure of Russian agriculture under the Tsardom to produce enough grain for the front line and the civilian territories in the old Russian Empire. That was, of course, the key motivating factor in the bread riots of February 1917. And, of course, land, which is, as Lenin pointed out in much of his agitational material, particularly after September of 1917, the inability of the Russian ruling class to efficiently feed the population was related to the inefficient usage of land by the big landowners. The refusal to cultivate sufficient land or keep livestock on the land. So much of the land was not used or not used effectively. And this all led to a situation where the population was starving. So, and also, land reform had been promised by the Tsardom and by the bourgeois for many decades, since the end of serfdom, in fact. If only really, in terms of the Tsarist government, only really Pyotr Stolypin came close to being able to do some kind of effective pro-bourgeois land reform, and he was assassinated by an SR socialist revolutionary double agent who was also working for the Okhrana. So he was probably killed by an internal enemy within the Tsarist government, who was employing the services of an SR double agent to do it. But the point being that this plan was put together by the Bolshevik leadership, led, of course, by Lenin, over the course of 1917, because Lenin, even before he got back, but especially after his return to Russia in April of 1917, was constantly looking at the demands being made by the working class and the peasantry, and how best the Bolsheviks could respond to that. But one of the things that Lenin correctly identified from the regime that emerged from the February Revolution was the fact that it was what he referred to as a dual power regime. Now, here I'm going to quote from Lenin's article of the same title. It's literally a short article entitled "On the Dual Power." I'm going to just post this into the chat so you can all see it. So I'll read a quick quotation from this. The article begins by saying the following: "The basic question of every revolution is that of state power. Unless this question is understood, there can be no intelligent participation in the revolution, not to speak of guidance of the revolution. The highly remarkable feature of our revolution is that it has brought about a dual power. This fact must be grasped first and foremost. Unless it is understood, we cannot advance. We must know how to supplement and amend old formulas, for example, those of Bolshevism. While they have been found to be correct on the whole, their concrete realization has turned out to be different. Nobody previously thought or could have thought of a dual power. What is this dual power? Alongside the provisional government, the government of bourgeoisie, another government has arisen, so far weak and incipient, but undoubtedly a government that actually exists and is growing, the Soviet of workers' and soldiers' deputies. This and this alone constitutes the essence of the Paris Commune as a special type of state. The essence that has been forgotten or perverted by the Plekhanovs, the Kautskys, and generally by all those social democrats, socialist revolutionaries, etc., who now rule the roost. They are trying to get away with empty phrases, evasion, subterfuges. They congratulate each other 1,000 times upon the revolution, but refuse to consider what the Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies are. They refuse to recognize the obvious truth. In as much as these Soviets exist, in as much as they are a power, we have in Russia a state of the type of the Paris Commune. So, what does Lenin mean by all of this? What he's talking about is the fact that following on from the 1905 revolution, which saw the Soviets of workers and peasants rise to be the power that was really challenging the Tsardom and became such a radical formation that the bourgeoisie panicked and ran away from the revolution. That the first sign of any real meaningful concession from the Tsar. Hence, why the liberals, personified in the personage of Pavel Milyukov, the head of the Cadet Party, rapidly agreed to the Tsar's manifesto promising a Duma in 1905 because they were terrified of the working class power as represented via the Soviets, these mass workers' councils that emerged spontaneously in the 1905 revolution. And the memory of these was kept alive by the Bolsheviks and others in the working class to the point where they emerged again as soon as the Tsardom fell in February of 1917. See, the crushing of the revolutionary upsurge that ran from 1905 to 1907 was believed by some to have crushed the revolution outright, but it turns out it was merely going into hibernation for the time that it would re-emerge more strongly, which was, of course, early 1917. So Lenin there in early April identifies the fact that the bourgeois government exists because those who dominated the Soviets in the earliest phases were Menshevik social revolutionaries, who both of whom for various reasons, none of them good, supported the rule of the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party, LPB, and the RSDLP, both of which again claimed the title of the party in Russia. The Mensheviks, people like Fyodor Dan To a lesser extent, Julius Martov, again, vacillated between a revolutionary and a reformist position. Basically, he remained a great friend of Lenin's until near the end of both of their lives. However, people like Fyodor Dan, Tsereteli, and other Menshevik leaders stated quite openly, along with Plekhanov, who was Lenin's old mentor, who turned on him and became a soldier of World War One. The way in which the Mensheviks saw things in terms of the progress of the revolution was that they believed the Tsardom needed to be replaced with a bourgeois regime that would then build up the necessary industrial economic base in order to then to build the proletariat further, in order then that socialism could come at some point further on down the line. So the way in which this played out was, of course, when the working class in Petrograd, Moscow, and other major urban centers, peasantry in the countryside, though the revolution in the countryside proceeded at a slightly different pace, but the advanced working class took power in Petrograd and Moscow. The theory was that the working class had to support a bourgeois regime which would get rid of the remnants of absolutism and build capitalism in Russia. This something that was actually possible in terms of what the building a strong capitalist system in Russia at the time was not something that was going to be possible, because the Russian bourgeoisie, as Lenin identified, was not only one that developed to the point where it had certain imperialist ambitions of its own, but that this was something that was a class that was dominated by those who financed it. And those who financed the development of capitalism in Russia were, principally France and Britain. The Germans were in there as well, but in a lesser degree. The United States was in there as well. So by the time you get the revolution in Russia in February 1917, March, New Style calendar, you have a lot of investment in Russia by the major imperialist powers. They would, by their banking system and their issuing of loans and credit, controlled effectively the development of capitalism in Russia, and they were essentially controllers of the Russian bourgeoisie. And the Russian bourgeoisie was always a pathetic and useless class, powered principally by foreign capital. Yes, it developed, there was a rapid development of capitalism in Russia, but it was developed via the financing and the control of the imperialist powers. So the Russian bourgeoisie were the creatures really of Britain and France, with the United States and Germany being in the mix as well. This, by the way, if you want to track who were the biggest participants in the wars of intervention following the October Revolution, track who had the biggest investments in pre-revolutionary Russia. These were wars of intervention designed to protect the investments of the various different imperialist bourgeoisies. So the way in which that played out was that the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, particularly the SRs being a sort of broad populist party, they were the two parties that dominated the Soviets of workers, peasants, and soldiers and sailors deputies in the early part of the revolution. In fact, they did so up until around about late August to September of 1917. So they, and this is where we're getting back to the dual power. So you had, in effect, the working centers leading the revolution. Their actions overthrew the Tsardom, or destabilized things to the point where the Tsardom had to essentially liquidate itself, which it did. But because at that time those who were in the leadership positions of the Soviet were essentially the leaders at that time of the Russian working class, completely abdicated their responsibilities to the point where they essentially were desperate to hand power to the Cadet Party, led by the historian Pavel Milyukov, and to others, such as those referred to as the Octoberists, led by the industrialists' favorite politician, Guchkov. And it was therefore a situation where the actual power had fallen into the hands of the working class, but the working class was led by people who didn't want that power. They wanted to give this power to the bourgeoisie. Now, this is a similar situation that recurs later, but with more terrible effects in Germany. Same thing happens, which is that there is a huge mutiny in the German Navy, increasing mutinies in the German army towards the very end of World War One due to the horrors and the hardships that had been inflicted not only by the British imperialists on Germany due to the naval blockade of Germany, but also by the German ruling class and their own population. You get a huge revolt in Germany. You get the emergence of Soviets, of workers, peasants, soldiers, and sailors, deputies. It is the actions of the German workers which destroy the regime of the Kaiser, and the Kaiser basically gets told by the German bourgeoisie, game's up, mein Herr, time to fuck off into exile, and dutifully does so. The Kaiser goes, and power falls into the hands of the Soviets, but unfortunately, there is no Lenin in Germany. Well, let's be fair. There is no Bolshevik party in Germany. If you are carrying out an analysis based on the dialectical materialist method, you will appreciate the horrible irony that everything turns into its opposite. So the very fact that there was such a strong and well-developed social democratic party in Germany prior to 1918, or prior to 1914, shall we say, that gave the German working class the preeminent position in the entire world in terms of being a revolutionary class, potentially. The elevators of the German social democracy, like Karl Kautsky, into the theoretical leaders of the Second International. This very strength turns into a horrible weakness after the German Revolution in 1918. Why? Because the fact that there had been, unlike in Russia, where the labor aristocracy was weaker, where the revolutionary tendency known as the Bolsheviks became really their own organization, despite being nominally still part of the RSDLP until 1917, were effectively their own organization with their own paper, multiple papers actually, and their own organization within the Russian working class and the working class of the other nations that made up the Russian Empire. They had their own leadership, their own theoretical understanding of things, and their own clearly defined positions that would change according to the needs of the class struggle, but with a set of positions that were clearly understood. All of that was lacking in Germany in 1918. Unfortunately, the split that came, led by amongst others Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, came too late. There was an insufficient level of revolutionary organization, or there was insufficient. The revolutionary party that was emerging was too weak, too small. The bulk of the masses still too committed to the Social Democrats. So essentially, in Germany, you have a situation in 1918 where all the power for a while did lie in the hands of the Soviets, like it did in certain terms in Russia, but the leadership relentlessly undercut that power and pushed everything in the direction of a bourgeois regime, of creating a bourgeois regime. And that's what happens in Germany, to tragic effect. In Russia, what happens is that, as Lenin points out in that article on the dual power, you have two systems running alongside each other. And the working class, over the course of 1917, chafes against the barriers that are being put up towards against working class power by the very same leaders who were the heads of the Soviets. And so, when Lenin, the April thesis, proclaiming all power to the Soviets and exposing the vacillations and the treachery of the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, this starts to receive some traction. In July of 1917, we reach the point where the advanced workers in Petrograd are almost ready to take power, but can't actually do it, and the Bolsheviks actually oppose them trying to take power at the time. And Lenin goes into this in um, writings that he did up to well, just before the October Revolution, where he talks about why it wasn't possible to take power in July of 1917, essentially because the conditions for the overthrow of the provisional government weren't yet there. And he goes into this in a fascinating article from mid-September of 1917. It's called Marxism in Insurrection. And in that, he goes into why it was necessary and possible to take power in September, October of 1917, and why it wasn't possible in July. See, what happens is because Lenin is observing a rapidly changing situation. Not only is it the case that the working class becomes progressively more and more radicalized as time goes on, or at least the advanced sections do, but also the forces of reaction, the bourgeoisie, the landlords, the heads of the multi-headed hydra of imperialism, principally though controlled at that time by the British and the French, with the Americans taking an increasingly prominent role. These are all forces which are rowing with each other and split about what to do. See, the Russian bourgeoisie had already reached the conclusion by September of 1917 that the current situation couldn't be sustained. See, if those who are our opponents, should we say, our liberal opponents, who like to interpret the Bolshevik Revolution as being the imposition of a horrible dictatorship versus the great democracy of Kerensky. Well, the liberal democracies, the liberal democracy that is the fantasies that exists in the fantasies of the liberals of today, was not on the cards in the Russia of 1917. What was on the cards was that there was the Russian bourgeoisie were aiming to put an end to the revolutionary process one way or the other. One way was through the imposition of military rule. And this was rehearsed, though it was a failed rehearsal, by the revolt of General Kornilov. General Kornilov was he's somebody whose name is largely forgotten now. He was a prominent Russian general known for his cruelty and savagery. He was appointed commander-in-chief of the Russian armed forces by Kerensky, and then, having been appointed by Kerensky as commander-in-chief in September of that year, in late August, early September, he was behind a military revolt that was designed specifically to crush the Soviets and to essentially crush working class and peasant power and establish a military regime. Now, this was defeated precisely because the Bolsheviks mobilized the most militant sections of the workers in Petrograd to go out and fraternize with Kornilov's largely peasant soldiers. And Kornilov, and this is one of the great moments of the revolutionary year of 1917, Kornilov was left with a bunch of officers and no army, because the workers all came out from Petrograd to greet the army as it marched on Petrograd, and they appealed to the peasant soldiers. They appealed to them to not fight for Kornilov, not fight for the restoration of bourgeois rule or the strengthening of bourgeois rule. And the army just melts away and disappears. Now, Kornilov fails completely. He reached his deserved end in 1918 in the Civil War. But that was a serious plot, not just by Kornilov as like a rogue military officer, but that was a serious plot by the bourgeoisie, possibly involving Kerensky himself, though there's never been clear exactly what his role is. But the Bolsheviks at that time mobilized the advanced layers of the working class, which they were strongest within, to defend the achievements of the revolution. And they even offered, as Lenin outlines, a block to the bourgeois Democrats, and to the Mensheviks and the SRs to defend the revolution against Kornilov and against the bourgeois plotters. This offer was not taken up, of course. But Lenin says, quite correctly, that it was right to march against and prevent the taking of power by Kornilov, and to defend at that stage the bourgeois republic. And also by offering a block to the leaders of the Mensheviks and the SRs, and to even the bourgeois Democrats against Kornilov, and the fact that this was not taken up by those leaders, they exposed the fact that the socialist revolutionaries, so-called, like led by Viktor Chernov, and the mix led by Tsereteli, Fyodor Dan, and others, were not even that interested in defending Soviet power at all. In fact, they were barely even interested in defending a bourgeois democratic republic. What they were interested in doing was defending their alliance with the Russian bourgeoisie. Then this was a key realization for the advanced workers to come to, that the men who'd been leading the Soviets since February, the big names that arguably were bigger than Lenin's in prior to February 1917. People who'd been men who were older, who'd been in the movement much longer, who were certainly electorally speaking more successful than him, but who by August of 1917 had been exposed as not only not wanting power to pass to the working class, but being active collaborators with a bourgeoisie which had already moved to the point where it was essentially pushing to establish like a military regime that would launch a blood-soaked crackdown on the Russian Revolution to destroy the organs of workers' power known as the Soviets. So this is the situation facing Lenin and the Bolsheviks in September to October of 1917 is not one where it was a choice between the overthrow of the Democratic Republic, so-called Democratic Republic, wasn't all that democratic, by an uprising of the working class, where it wasn't a choice between bourgeois democracy and Bolshevik tyranny or something, to quote our liberal friends. It was a choice between revolution led by the workers and peasants, or a sort of proto-fascist tyranny headed by headed by the commanders of the Russian military, like Kornilov, like the later leaders of the white armies, like Denikin, or the others, Kolchak, and the various other criminals who were prepared to engage with the imperialists to plot the dismemberment of Russia. And this is something which I think is worth dwelling on, because again, this comes back to something which the Russian liberals, including Putin, go on and on about, how Lenin dismembered Russia, etc., etc. And this is also something which you get like various crankish libertarians and fascist types in the West talking about, particularly the fraudulent so-called historian Anthony Sutton, talking about how Wall Street funded the Bolsheviks, etc., etc. Actually, Wall Street was in bed with the Russian bourgeoisie and was pushing for an aggressive military intervention against the Bolsheviks later on, because they seized property that was owned by American bourgeois. but I digress slightly. The point about it is that the way in which the situation was developing in 1917, where it was going to be a choice between is either revolution led by the workers or the most nightmarish reaction led by the likes of the likes of Kolchak, Denikin, or Kornilov, and that was the choice that was on offer. The third ways, anarchist communes, various other fantasies of the petty bourgeoisie. These are things that were phantasms. There were choices at the time. Now, now we get to the point where we're going to discuss why Lenin comes to the conclusion that an insurrection is necessary. He comes to that conclusion. He's always called for all power going to the Soviets. But as he explains repeatedly throughout his analysis in 1917, if you're a scientific socialist, you need to do a lot more than just endlessly repeating slogans. This is the thing that if you take nothing else from Lenin's life and example, you can take this, which is that he was never afraid to redevelop the program or redo the program of the Bolsheviks. Retool its understanding, launch new slogans, launch a new program. Like the mere idea of launching a program with three simple words, or three simple demands, peace, bread, land, was something that was developed throughout the course of 1917 as a means of appealing to the workers and peasants. So Lenin, in a key piece of writing, this was a letter that he wrote to the Bolshevik Central Committee in mid-September, September 13th to 14th, 1917. And this is where he refers to the art of insurrection, because of course he's been calling for the overthrow of the provisional government, and he first has to convince his own comrades in the Bolshevik Party. Remember, people like Zinoviev, people like Kamenev, and others still had an understanding of the situation that was closer to Menshevism, which is they still believed that there's some kind of accommodation could be reached with the Russian bourgeoisie, that the overthrowing the bourgeois government was not necessary or wasn't desirable, that it would lead to a disaster. So he needs to win over the Central Committee first and foremost. So of course, his opponents accused him of what is referred to as Blanchism. Now, I've gone into this before, but briefly, this refers to the life, not necessarily the works, but certainly the life of Louis-Auguste Blanqui. Now, Louis-Auguste Blanqui was a famous French revolutionary or infamous, depending upon your point of view, who achieved great fame for the fact that he was always ready, the man who would be ready to call for the insurrection. And he tried to engage in multiple revolutionary insurrections in France in the 19th century. Spent a lot of time in prison. Was certainly a very brave and heroic individual in many respects, but a man who made a name for himself, basically having premature insurrections, shall we say. Now, the way in which Lenin approached the question of insurrection is as follows. Now, I'll quote directly from this work. I'll drop the link in the description, and is in the chat. Sorry, so you can have a look at this. This is from Lenin's article. I'll read this. Quote reads as follows: Marxists are accused of Blanchism for treating insurrection as an art. Can there be a more flagrant perversion of the truth? Where not a single Marxist will deny that it was Marx who expressed himself on this score in the most definite, precise, and categorical manner, referring to insurrection specifically as an art, saying that it must be treated as an art, that you must win the first success and then proceed from success to success, never ceasing the offensive against the enemy, taking advantage of his confusion, etc. To be successful, insurrection must rely not upon conspiracy, not upon a party, but upon the advanced class. That is the first point. insurrection must rely upon a revolutionary upsurge of the people. That is the second point. Insurrection must rely upon that turning point in the history of the growing revolution when the activity of the advanced ranks of the people is at its height, and when the vacillations in the ranks of the enemy and in the ranks of the weak, half-hearted, and irresolute friends of the revolution are strongest. That is the third point. And these three conditions for raising the question of insurrection distinguish Marxism from Blanchism. Once these conditions exist, however, to refuse to treat insurrection as an art is a betrayal of Marxism and a betrayal of the revolution. So he goes on to argue, and again state why in early July 3rd to 4th in 1917, it was not possible for the Bolsheviks to actually take power. Because, as he says, point one, at the time, the Bolsheviks lacked the support of the advanced layers of the workers, at least not in the numbers that would have been necessary. And there was no, at that time, countrywide upsurge. And he says, there is now, after the Kornilov revolt, the situation in the provinces and assumption of power by the Soviets in many localities proved this. And there was not sufficient vacillation on behalf of their enemies. And that by enemies, he doesn't just refer to the Russian bourgeoisie, he refers also to world imperialism, principally meaning the British, the French, and the Americans. Because, of course, by this stage, the United States had entered the war in Europe in a decisive fashion. So he concludes that, therefore, there would have been not any chance of maintaining power, even if they'd managed to grab it in Petrograd for a few hours. See, after the point about where Kornilov had tried his failed insurrection, the dual power turned into like a real active power struggle already across the country. Now, here I'll turn to the work of the famous or infamous John Reed, who was something of a curious figure. He was, again, immortalized in the very over-the-top Warren Beatty film Reds. Here's a guy who was an American journalist who has been argued at various points was either a hero of the Soviet Revolution or a double agent on behalf of the American intelligence services, or both. Certainly a fascinating character. And to answer the question from Ash in the chat, yes, it's worth reading because this is a book that was actually promoted by the Soviet government itself very early on. So regardless of whatever exactly Reed was up to, I tend to think of him as some sort of an adventurer who got swept up along in things. He had undoubtedly had an association with American intelligence. Quite what role he was playing in Russia in 1917 is an interesting question. But certainly the book itself is very good, and the Soviet government evidently did think Reed was worth something because they buried him in the Kremlin wall. So interesting character, dubious past, but again, a book very much worth reading. So to give you an indication of what's going on in Russia immediately after the failed Kornilov revolt and before the seizure of power in the October Revolution by the Bolsheviks, we have this sort of period in the middle where there is the civil war has essentially already started. There is the tenuous balance that was there between the bourgeois government and the Soviets is falling to pieces, and there's open confrontation breaking out all over the country now between the Soviets and the bourgeois regime. So this is from chapter 3 of Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, and this reads as follows. This is the opening of chapter 3. In the relations of a weak government and a rebellious people, there comes a time when every act of the authorities exasperates the masses and every refusal to act excites their contempt. The proposal to abandon Petrograd raised a hurricane. Now, I'll just briefly pause there. This was a plan that had been kicked around allegedly in the circles of government by Kerensky and co., that they were going to abandon Petrograd and retreat to a more defensible position due to the advance of the Germans. This, of course, went down exceedingly badly, given that Kerensky had been banging on at the behest of his paymasters in London and Paris, and also New York, They'd been banging on about defending a war of defense for the revolution, therefore justifying Russia's continued participation in the imperialist war. And so then to turn from that to saying that they were going to abandon Petrograd did not go down well. Quote continues, Kerensky's public denial that the government had any such intention was met with hoots of derision. Pinned to the wall by the pressure of the revolution, says the newspaper Rabochi Put, the government of provisional bourgeois tries to get free by giving out lying assurances that it never thought of fleeing Petrograd and that it didn't wish to surrender the capital. In Kharkov, current day Ukraine, though maybe for not much longer, 30,000 coal miners organized, adopting the preamble of the IWW Constitution, which reads as follows: the working class and the employing class have nothing in common. Quote ends. Dispersed by Cossacks, some were locked out by the mine owners, and the rest declared a general strike. Minister of Commerce and Industry Kornilov appointed his assistant Orlov with plenary powers to settle the trouble. Orlov was hated by the miners, but the CEK not only supported his appointment, but refused to demand that the Cossacks be recalled from the Don Basin. This was followed by the dispersal of the Soviet at Kaluga. The Bolsheviks, having secured a majority in the Soviet, set free some political prisoners. With the sanction of the government commissar, the Municipal Duma called in troops from Minsk and bombarded the Soviets' headquarters with artillery, much like Yeltsin would do in 1993. Quote continues, the Bolsheviks yielded, but as they left the building, the Cossacks attacked them, crying, "This is what we'll do to all the other Bolshevik Soviets, including those of Moscow and Petrograd." This incident sent a wave of panicked rage throughout Russia. In Petrograd was ending a regional Congress of Soviets of the North, presided over by the Bolshevik Krylenko. By an immense majority, it resolved that all power should be assumed by the All-Russian Congress, and concluded by greeting the Bolsheviks in prison, bidding them rejoice, for the hour of their liberation was at hand. At the same time, the first All-Russian Conference of Factory Shop Committees emphatically declared for the Soviets and continued significantly. After liberating themselves politically from Tsardom, the working class wants to see the democratic regime triumphant in the sphere of its productive activity. This is best expressed by workers' control over industrial production, which naturally arose in the atmosphere of economic decomposition created by the criminal policy of the dominating classes. And that's a statement from the All-Russian Conference of Factory Shop Committees. See, what had occurred by that 1917 was the fact that the Russian working class was the most militant and the most well-organized anywhere in the world, and that the Russian peasantry was also becoming radicalized to the point where it was taking matters into its own hands. So by September of 1917, it is the case that in Moscow and in Petrograd, the Bolsheviks are now in the ascendancy. They control the two leading centers of the revolution in Russia, and they are now in a position where they can actually depose the provisional government. Because, again, let's be clear, the choice isn't now between some imaginary democratic government led by Kerensky or somebody else and the Bolsheviks. It's between the Bolsheviks and some form of Russian fascism. That's what the choice is now. Because the bourgeoisie has already gone and decided, at least the bulk of them have, that the bourgeois democratic regime is not for them. They want what they see as the chaos of the revolution to be ended, and they're terrified by the fact that you have this gigantic wave of politicization sweeping through the entire working class in Russia itself. And this is something that they definitely want to be brought to a close. So, again, let's re-emphasize this point. By the time we get to late September 1917, it is the case that in Russia and in the leading centers of the revolution in Russia, Petrograd and Moscow, and in other major urban centers, the advanced layers of the working class have all gone over to the Bolsheviks. The social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks have become completely discredited. The bourgeoisie has already decided that they are going to go for dictatorship, and also that they're going to call for foreign intervention to protect their investments, which they ultimately did. And so this is the point that we reach when Lenin makes his case that it is time to seize power. It is time for but it must be, as he says in his letter on the art of insurrection, you must seize power like as a move made by the advanced working class. Yes, with the vanguard party playing its role, putting that idea out there to the advanced working class. But if you don't have the masses of the advanced workers behind you, then you cannot take power and you cannot hold it. So I'll bring my comments on this to a close, and what we'll do is this is like the preamble, shall we say. So we'll get into the meat of the, shall we say, the operation, just of the October insurrection next weekend when it's the anniversary. And so this is the necessary preamble for it. And to re-emphasize the points, Lenin correctly analyzes from early on in the revolution that there is a situation of dual power, where actual power might have been in the hands of the bourgeoisie, but that was only there because the advanced workers at that stage were still behind pro-bourgeois opportunist forces in terms of the SRs and the Mensheviks, and that there was a crisis of this regime, of this dual power regime, came to be expressed in more and more violent terms by the moves of the bourgeoisie to break up the dual power and to impose an open bourgeois military dictatorship headed by Kornilov or somebody else, and that this further radicalized the advanced layers of the working class into swinging behind the Bolsheviks, so that by September of 1917 they could claim with legitimacy to be the leading force in the Soviets throughout the nation, especially in the major urban centers. And it was at this point that insurrection becomes possible, because not only are the Bolsheviks now have the allegiance of the advanced layers of the working class, but also, as Lenin correctly points out, they also had a situation that was more favorable because their enemies, the bourgeoisie and the imperialists, were squabbling with each other. They did the British imperialists and the French definitely wanted to put an end to the revolution in Russia and impose a bourgeois regime, but they didn't quite know how to do it. They also were squabbling amongst themselves about how best to resolve things with regard to the war. And that was another problem that the imperialists had. They were desperate to stop the revolutionary process in Russia, but they also were desperate to crush their rival imperialism, the Germans. They weren't prepared to make a peace with the Germans to combine to attack the revolution in Russia. The requirements of British imperialism was still very much that German imperialism be destroyed. But then this is why Lenin was able to correctly analyze the situation, that there was this split and vacillations in the enemy camp because they couldn't decide what they wanted to do more. They needed to do both, and they didn't have the ability to do it, which gives the revolution crucial breathing space in terms of the ability to actually act against the Russian bourgeoisie, mobilize the masses, and prepare a defense of the country against the inevitable foreign intervention that would follow. Their foreign intervention came shortly afterwards and intensified after they'd settled things with the Germans. But those crucial few months where the French and the British were divided about what they wanted to do, that gave the Bolsheviks opportunity to act that they might not have had otherwise. See, it's about, as Lenin points out over and over again in all of his writing about tactics and strategies in 1917, you have to be able to correctly identify the moment to move. And we'll come back to more of that next week. So this is our preamble, shall we say. This sets up our examination of the actual events of the revolution of 1917 and its immediate aftermath, which we'll do next week. So I'm just going to pause now to go through a few comments. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in. We have, let's just have a quick look at this. Where are we? Where are we? We have just over 500 of you watching. That's very good. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. So, hello to Ash. Hello to G4RG4N2U4. Very strange name, but then again, YouTube has changed everybody's name. So, yes, the Gramsci program is on Tuesday. Be sure to tune in for that one. Hello to Daniel in Somerset, Bulgarian Communists, Pat in Bristol, Abtin, Wicked Witch of the Southeast, Jerry, President Jesus, Mogman Dog, Anthony in Prague, Nikki in Athens. We got Davy in the wild country of Wales. We have Spakolos over on Twitch. We have Pablo Popova. We have Zama out there in Phoenix, Arizona. We have YA Ain't Cool also on Twitch. Slowly, Twitch is going forward. We've now got 5 viewers on there, including some anti-communists, which is always fun. So, yes, Kickstream will return tomorrow. Hello to Gamer Jame over there on Twitch. Hello to David King and Irish Partisan, comrade out there in Minsk. Hello to Zukov's Boots, Alistair Page McGill, Chris in Hong Kong. Mr. Nobody says, what are the sources, books you use for this analysis? Well, the sources are various articles by Lenin from 1917. I'll post all those on the Telegram channel. In fact, I will post them on Twitter as well. But in terms of the books, it's I reuse the official history of the CPSU. As a collective work, some say it was written by Stalin. It was actually written by a number of people. I also used, interestingly enough, Trotsky's book on the revolution, which is interesting, if only because it reveals how much of a wild egomaniac he was. But it contains some interesting historical detail because he was very much involved in the Petrograd Soviet, joining the Bolsheviks, of course, at the absolute last minute when it became clear that they were going to be the winners. Man was an opportunist to the core. Not that he didn't do some things that were very significant, particularly with the Red Army, but if you read his book, you really do see that the man was an absolute narcissist. There's the old phrase, I think it's attributed to a British intelligence official, that Trotsky would die for Russia, but only if there was a sufficiently large audience that would watch him do so. When did Trotsky finally decide to join the Bolsheviks? I believe it was September of 1917 that when he decided, finally, him and his group, the Mezrayontsy, or the Inter-Party group, the group that sort of flip-flopped between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, joined up at the absolute last minute when it became clear that Menshevism was finished. There's an interesting wrinkle to the Menshevik story. They became the heads of a very reactionary, blood-soaked government that existed in Georgia just in the Russian Civil War. We'll be getting back to that next week, though. So, have I ever read any of Kotkin's books on Stalin? I've seen he talks about the October Revolution. He's very hostile. No, I haven't. I've got Grover Furr's book debunking Kotkin. That's going to be an interesting one to read. But Furr claims that Kotkin is, of course, very dishonest, because if you write anti-Stalin, anti-Bolshevik work, you're never required to actually tell the truth. You can rely upon like a scrawled note by a fascist from 1925, and that will be presented as the God's honest truth, and all of the bourgeois academia will believe you. Reds is an anti-communist film, says President Jesus. It is indeed, which is funny because John Reed, whatever the man's, the reality of the man's life, was very, very much pro-Soviet, but they managed to turn it into an anti-communist film. Of course, well, it's Warren fucking Beatty. The guy's a Hollywood liberal. What the hell do we expect? Albert says, side note on Marshal Semyon Budyonny, also a friend of Stalin. Kotkin tends to replicate lies about him as an uneducated buffoon, yet he graduated first in his military academy prior to World War One. Also, a U.S. Army major report on cavalry led by Budyonny, published in 1945, rates his performance highly, including the Bagration mixed cavalry tank units used by Rokossovsky in June of 1944. Interesting. President Jesus says, Candace Owens couldn't shut up about Bolshevik Christian genocide during her recent interview with Norman Finkelstein. Is this the newest version of the Holodomor? It's the new American right-wing obsession. But then again, it's been a sort of reactionary talking point for 100 years, so why would it change now? It's just that Owens is a particularly dumb example of that kind of propaganda. Ash says, apparently Trotsky appears more in John Reed's book than Stalin, which makes me suspicious. Yeah, that's true, because Reed was covering things in and around Petrograd, and Trotsky was the head of the Petrograd Soviet. Stalin was doing more, shall we say, future general secretary type work, organizing all various different elements within the Bolshevik Party. That he wasn't the public face that Trotsky was. Reed, and he's writing this, he's writing about the comings and goings and the toing and froing in the Petrograd Soviet. So inevitably, Trotsky, being the head of it, is going to feature prominently in that. But Stalin's on the Bolshevik Central Committee, and he's doing organizational work that's absolutely crucial for the success of the party in the revolution. Just that Reed is reporting on the spokesman and the hierarchy of the Petrograd Soviet. So yes, Trotsky's going to appear in there quite a lot. The Trotskyites love to highlight Reed's work for exactly that reason, because it gives Trotsky this very elevated role, which of course there's no denying that he did play that role, but it of course leaves out the work done by people like Stalin and others, which was just as important to the success of the revolution. So you have to bear in mind what Reed's reporting about and what layer he's reporting on. He's not reporting on the stuff that's sort of behind the scenes and hidden away, because that is the organizational work done by Stalin to strengthen the party is tremendously important to the success of the revolution. It's also why Stalin becomes general secretary, because Trotsky's role is more flamboyant and showy, but Stalin's the one who's actually building the party up. Again, not something that Reed writes about, but the Trotskyists love that because it presents their hero in the best possible light, which he's the flamboyant showman. He's the one who's sticking his finger in the face of Tseretelli and Dan and Martov and others to tell them what for. See, Trotsky's role in that is elevated beyond even Lenin, because Trotsky is actively operating out in the open in September of 1917, whereas Lenin is driven into exile for a few months following the July days and has to go into exile in disguise in Finland and smuggle his writing back in to Russia for a while, whereas Trotsky's role remains very prominent. So this is why the Trotskyites love to talk about John Reed's work. I think everybody should read Reed's work, but you have to bear in mind the situation and why Trotsky has that prominent role and why others don't. So, hello to Jennifer from Australia. Edward, hello to you. It says Isko Lat Republic was declared on the 21st of November 1917 in modern day Latvia, third socialist state in the world. Later, the Isko Lat Latvians, together with Stalin, built the USSR, but killed by Yezhov. Yes, we'll get to the Yezhov years in future episodes, I think. Some of the Marxist-Leninists, said Edward, in the USSR were killed by Yezhov en masse between 36 and 38, including the majority of Latvian Marxist-Leninists. The revolutionaries woke up too late. Yezhov did major damage. Yes, and that's undoubtedly the case. Like where you get I mean, but in the 30s, the revolutionary process is still playing out. 20 years isn't a long time in a revolution. Bear in mind, let's use the English Revolution as an example of a bourgeois revolution. The revolution here, or I should say, south of the border these days, the revolution in England ran from, well, arguably 1640 odd through to, well, arguably, if you go by the ideas expressed by the analysis of Christopher Hill, goes all the way up to like 1714, or beyond that to 1745. So like that's almost a century of a revolutionary process, and that's the bourgeois revolution. So 20 years is not a long time. You're going to get in that time all kinds of attempts at sabotage, all kinds of agendas playing out, all kinds of battles going on. Yezhov, and before him Yagoda, getting the positions that they had tells us that there was a serious attempt from within to destroy the Bolshevik Party, destroy the CPSUB. They were just about prevented from doing that. But again, it shows you this is what happens in these revolutionary processes. All kinds of reactionary agendas actually get forced being expressed within the Revolutionary Party itself. Like this is, and again, like no one denies that it was a mistake to let such characters rise as far as they did. But again, it's very hard to stop them. Eventually, they were stopped, but only after they'd done a lot of serious damage. But the point to emphasize is that the reason why so many good revolutionaries were put to death was precisely because this was a reactionary clique led by Yezhov. And this leads some to defend, of course, Beria, who was brought in to undo the damage of Yezhov, and in fact, in fairness, did undo the damage of Yezhov for a while and retooled the NKVD again. Something for future episodes, of course. Okay, so tomorrow I'll be back again with a stream looking at US-China trade talks and Trump's surrender. So going to be looking at that tomorrow from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Please join me for that. And then we're back again with the Gramsci stream on Tuesday. More episodes of Decline and Fall coming up this week, including more interviews and more stuff about the 30th anniversary of the end of the Bosnian War. Be sure to tune in for that. Thank you for joining me this evening. And I'll leave you with your appropriate outro, which is commemorates, of course, the great revolutionary we've been discussing principally tonight, which is Lenin. Lenin is young again. Thank you for tuning in, and good night.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы.
Продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.